Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Nevada history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1852, when the Sierra Nevada mountains still whispered promises of gold to desperate men, the small mining camp of Silver Creek nestled between weathered hills like a secret kept too long. The settlement consisted of no more than 30 wooden structures, their boards already warped by the harsh desert winds that swept down from the peaks each evening. Among those who called this desolate place home was a young woman named Elizabeth Catherine Hartwell, 23 years old, whose presence in such a rough frontier town had become the subject of considerable speculation among the miners who gathered each night at Murphy's saloon. Elizabeth had arrived in Silver Creek during the spring of that same year, accompanying her intended husband, Thomas Franklin Morrison, a prospector from Pennsylvania who had invested his family's modest savings in mining equipment and dreams of striking it rich. Morrison, 28 years old and possessed of the kind of quiet determination that marked successful frontier settlers, had established a modest claim along the creek that gave the settlement its name. The couple planned to marry once Morrison's mine began producing enough gold to support a proper household, a common arrangement in those uncertain times when fortunes could be made or lost with a single shovel full of earth. The engagement had been announced through a brief notice in the territorial newspaper, and Elizabeth wore a simple gold band on her left hand, a promise ring that caught the light during the long afternoons when she worked in the small garden she had cultivated behind their shared cabin. Neighbors described her as reserved but pleasant, with dark hair that she kept pinned beneath a practical bonnet, and a way of moving through the camp that suggested both dignity and an awareness of her vulnerable position as one of only 4 women in a settlement, populated primarily by unmarried men, far from home. During those early months, life in Silver Creek followed the predictable rhythm of frontier mining communities. Men worked their claims during daylight hours, returning to the settlement as shadows lengthened across the mountains. Elizabeth spent her days maintaining their modest home, tending her garden, and occasionally assisting Mrs. Eleanor Brennan, the camp's unofficial nurse, with the treatment of minor injuries that were commonplace in mining work. Evenings brought the sound of hammers against anvils as equipment was repaired, the low murmur of conversation, and sometimes the melancholy notes of a harmonica played by someone whose name has been lost to time. But beneath this veneer of ordinary frontier life, tensions had been building throughout the summer months. Morrison's claim had proven less productive than anticipated, yielding only modest amounts of gold dust that barely covered the cost of equipment and supplies. Financial pressure strained not only Morrison but several other miners in the camp, men who had invested everything in the belief that Nevada's mountains would provide the prosperity that had eluded them in their previous lives. The situation was further complicated by the arrival, in late July, of a man who would ultimately shatter the fragile stability of Silver Creek. George Washington Phillips presented himself as a former cavalry officer from Texas, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and the kind of confident bearing that suggested military service. He claimed to have served in the Mexican War and spoke with authority about mining techniques he had allegedly learned in California's gold fields. Phillips rented a small cabin at the edge of camp and quickly established himself as someone whose opinions carried weight among the other miners. He possessed a substantial amount of ready cash, enough to purchase quality equipment and supplies without the careful consideration that marked the purchases of less fortunate prospectors. What the residents of Silver Creek did not know was that George Phillips was not the man he claimed to be. His real name was Charles Edward Whitmore, and he was a fugitive from justice in both Texas and California, wanted in connection with a series of confidence schemes that had defrauded investors of thousands of dollars in gold. The money he spent so freely in Silver Creek represented the life savings of trusting individuals who had believed his promises of profitable mining ventures in other territories. Phillips had perfected the art of reinvention, adopting new identities as easily as other men changed clothes, always staying one step ahead of the law while searching for his next opportunity. By early September, Phillips had ingratiated himself with several members of the camp, including Morrison, who found the older man's supposed expertise valuable as he struggled to make his claim profitable. Phillips offered advice about ore extraction techniques and shared stories of successful mining operations he claimed to have witnessed in other territories. More significantly, he began to pay increasing attention to Elizabeth, offering to assist with heavy tasks around the Morrison cabin and engaging her in conversations about life beyond the harsh realities of frontier mining. Elizabeth's response to Phillips's attention would later become a matter of considerable debate among those who knew her. Some neighbors recalled that she seemed uncomfortable with his presence, politely declining his offers of assistance and maintaining the reserved demeanor that had characterized her behavior since arriving in Silver Creek. Others, however, reported observing what appeared to be friendly conversations between Phillips and Elizabeth during the afternoons when Morrison was working his claim. These conflicting accounts would prove crucial to understanding the events that followed. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came on the morning of September 28, 1852, when Morrison discovered that Elizabeth was not in their cabin. Her bed appeared to have been slept in, but personal items including clothing and a small jewelry box that had belonged to her mother were missing. More alarming still was the absence of Phillips, whose cabin stood empty with the door hanging open as if he had departed in considerable haste. Several valuable items that Phillips had purchased during his time in Silver Creek were gone, but more modest possessions, including books and mining tools, remained scattered on the floor. Morrison immediately organized a search party, and by noon, nearly every able-bodied man in Silver Creek was combing the surrounding hills and valleys for any sign of the missing pair. The search revealed tracks leading northeast from the camp toward a mountain pass that connected with established trails leading to other mining settlements in the region. The tracks appeared to indicate two horses moving at a steady pace rather than in desperate flight, a detail that puzzled those who assumed they were pursuing kidnappers and their victim. As the search continued through the afternoon and into the evening, a more disturbing possibility began to emerge. Samuel Porter, who ran the camp's general store, revealed that Phillips had made several unusual purchases during the week prior to the disappearance, including supplies that suggested preparation for extended travel. Even more significantly, Porter recalled that Elizabeth had been present during one of these shopping expeditions, and that she had seemed to be actively participating in the selection of items rather than accompanying Phillips under duress. The implications of this revelation transformed the nature of the investigation. Rather than searching for a kidnapping victim and her abductor, the men of Silver Creek found themselves confronting the possibility that Elizabeth had voluntarily departed with Phillips, abandoning her engagement to Morrison and her life in the mining camp. This interpretation was supported by the discovery in Elizabeth's former cabin of her engagement ring carefully placed on the small table where she and Morrison had shared their evening meals. Morrison's reaction to these developments was described by witnesses as one of complete bewilderment, followed by what could only be characterized as emotional collapse. He had invested not only his financial resources, but his emotional well-being in the belief that Elizabeth shared his commitment to their future together. The suggestion that she had chosen to abandon that future in favor of departure with a virtual stranger challenged everything Morrison thought he understood about the woman he had planned to marry. The search for Elizabeth and Phillips continued for 3 days, ranging across an increasingly wide area as trackers followed various leads through the mountain passes. On October 1st, the search party encountered a group of travelers who reported seeing a man and woman matching the descriptions of the missing pair at a trading post approximately 40 miles northeast of Silver Creek. The travelers reported that the couple had purchased additional supplies and had inquired about routes leading toward the California border. This sighting effectively ended the organized search effort. The men of Silver Creek were miners, not professional trackers, and the demands of their claims prevented extended absence from their work. More importantly, the growing consensus was that Elizabeth had made a deliberate choice to leave, which complicated the moral and legal justification for pursuing her. If she had departed willingly, even if it meant breaking her engagement to Morrison, the residents of Silver Creek had no clear authority to forcibly return her to a life she had apparently rejected. Morrison, however, refused to accept this interpretation of events. In the days following the end of the formal search, he continued to venture into the mountains alone, following increasingly tenuous leads and clinging to the belief that Elizabeth had been taken against her will. His behavior during this period was described by neighbors as obsessive and self-destructive. He neglected his mining claim, consumed his savings on supplies for futile search expeditions, and spent hours each evening walking the perimeter of the camp as if expecting Elizabeth's return. The situation took a darker turn in mid-October, when Morrison encountered James Whitfield, a traveling merchant who had known Phillips during his time in California. Whitfield revealed that the man calling himself George Phillips was actually Charles Whitmore, a fugitive wanted in connection with multiple fraud schemes. More disturbing still was Whitfield's account of Whitmore's methods, which relied heavily on his ability to charm and manipulate women into assisting with his criminal enterprises. According to Whitfield, Whitmore had previously convinced at least 2 other women to abandon their homes and families, promising them prosperous futures in distant territories where his supposed mining expertise would ensure their financial security. In each case, Whitfield claimed, the women had eventually been abandoned once Whitmore had extracted whatever financial benefit their association provided. The pattern suggested that Elizabeth's departure with Phillips represented not a romantic elopement, but her recruitment into a criminal scheme that would ultimately leave her stranded and destitute. This revelation transformed Morrison's understanding of the situation and intensified his determination to locate Elizabeth before she suffered the fate that had apparently befallen Whitmore's previous victims. With the assistance of Whitfield, who claimed to know Whitmore's likely destinations, Morrison organized a second search expedition. This one aimed not at bringing Elizabeth home, but at rescuing her from what was now understood to be a dangerous criminal. The expedition departed Silver Creek on October 20th, consisting of Morrison, Whitfield, and 2 other miners who had volunteered their assistance. They followed the established California Trail northeast from the camp, making inquiries at trading posts and settlements along the route. For several days, they found no trace of the couple they pursued, but on October 24th, near a settlement called Pine Ridge, they encountered a woman who provided information that would prove crucial to understanding Elizabeth's fate. Margaret Sullivan, the wife of Pine Ridge's blacksmith, reported that a man and woman matching the descriptions of Phillips and Elizabeth had spent 2 nights at the settlement's boarding house during the first week of October. Sullivan had spoken with the woman who had introduced herself as Mrs. George Phillips and had claimed to be traveling to California, where her husband planned to establish a mining operation. The conversation had struck Sullivan as odd because the woman had seemed nervous and had asked several questions about the availability of stage transportation to larger cities, questions that seemed inconsistent with plans to establish a rural mining operation. More significantly, Sullivan reported that she had observed the couple arguing on their second evening in Pine Ridge, a heated discussion that had taken place outside the boarding house and had concluded with the woman appearing to capitulate to whatever the man had demanded. Sullivan had been troubled enough by this exchange to mention it to her husband, but neither had felt justified in intervening in what they assumed was a domestic dispute between married travelers. Armed with this information, Morrison's party continued their pursuit, but the trail grew increasingly cold as they moved deeper into the mountains. The couple they sought had apparently avoided the main settlements, instead following remote trails that offered little opportunity for contact with potential witnesses. By early November, with winter weather beginning to threaten travel through the mountain passes, Morrison was forced to acknowledge that his search had reached its practical limits. The return to Silver Creek marked the beginning of a period that residents would later describe as one of the darkest in the camp's brief history. Morrison's obsession with finding Elizabeth had consumed not only his own resources, but had drawn other miners away from their claims during crucial weeks when weather conditions favored intensive extraction work. The financial impact of the lost time rippled through the small community, contributing to an atmosphere of resentment that complicated efforts to maintain the cooperative spirit essential to frontier survival. Morrison himself had been transformed by the experience from a respected member of the community into a figure of pity and, increasingly, irritation. His continued speculation about Elizabeth's fate and his repeated requests for assistance in organizing additional search expeditions wore on the patience of neighbors who had their own challenges to address. By December, Morrison was largely isolated within the camp, his social connections strained beyond repair by months of behavior that others considered irrational and self-indulgent. The winter of 1852 proved particularly harsh, with heavy snowfall that effectively cut Silver Creek off from communication with the outside world for nearly 3 months. During this period of enforced isolation, stories about Elizabeth's disappearance evolved and multiplied, taking on characteristics that reflected the storyteller's own fears and prejudices about frontier life. Some accounts portrayed her as an innocent victim of a sophisticated criminal, while others suggested that she had been a willing participant in schemes that extended beyond her relationship with Morrison. These conflicting narratives revealed fundamental tensions within frontier society about the roles and expectations placed on women in isolated mining communities. Elizabeth's departure challenged assumptions about feminine virtue and loyalty that many residents had carried with them from more established Eastern communities. The possibility that a woman might choose to abandon an engagement in favor of an uncertain future with a charming stranger forced uncomfortable questions about the stability and desirability of frontier life itself. When spring finally arrived and communication with the outside world resumed, Morrison received information that would provide partial answers to the questions that had consumed him throughout the winter months. A letter from authorities in Sacramento reported that a man matching Phillips's description had been arrested in connection with a confidence scheme targeting recent arrivals to California's gold fields. The man had been traveling alone and had claimed to be recently widowed when questioned about a woman's belongings found in his possession. The woman's belongings included items that Morrison recognized as having belonged to Elizabeth, including a distinctive cameo brooch that had been her mother's and a small leather journal in which she had recorded her thoughts about frontier life. The presence of these items suggested that Elizabeth had indeed traveled to California with Phillips, but their possession by a man claiming to be widowed raised disturbing questions about her ultimate fate. Morrison immediately departed for Sacramento, carrying letters of introduction from Silver Creek residents who hoped that official investigation might provide closure to the questions that had divided their community throughout the winter. His journey proved frustrating, however, as California authorities were dealing with numerous cases involving confidence schemes and fraud, and the arrest of the man calling himself Phillips represented only one thread in a complex web of criminal activity. The prisoner, who had provided yet another false identity when arrested, initially denied any knowledge of Elizabeth Hartwell or events in Silver Creek. When confronted with evidence including Elizabeth's personal belongings, however, he admitted to having traveled with a woman matching her description, but claimed that she had departed voluntarily during their journey through the mountains. According to his account, Elizabeth had grown disillusioned with their plans and had chosen to return east, using money she had saved from the sale of personal items. This explanation provided little satisfaction to Morrison, who found the prisoner's story inconsistent with his knowledge of Elizabeth's character and financial situation. The authorities, however, were primarily interested in prosecuting the confidence schemes for which they had solid evidence, and the question of Elizabeth's fate remained secondary to their investigation of documented financial crimes. After several weeks in Sacramento, Morrison was forced to return to Silver Creek with questions unanswered and Elizabeth's ultimate fate remaining a mystery. The summer of 1853 brought new residents to Silver Creek, miners attracted by reports of modest but consistent gold production in the area. Among these newcomers was a traveling minister named Reverend Jonathan Hayes, who had spent several years serving mining communities throughout the territory. Hayes took a particular interest in Morrison's story, and in the broader questions about community responsibility and moral obligation that Elizabeth's disappearance had raised. Through conversations with long-term residents, Hayes pieced together a more complete picture of the events leading to Elizabeth's departure and their impact on Silver Creek's social fabric. His analysis suggested that the community's response to the crisis had reflected underlying tensions about gender, authority, and mutual obligation that were common in frontier settlements, but had been brought into sharp focus by the circumstances of the case. Hayes also conducted his own investigation into Elizabeth's character and motivations, interviewing residents who had known her during her months in Silver Creek. These conversations revealed a more complex picture of Elizabeth's life in the mining camp than had emerged during the immediate aftermath of her disappearance. Several women reported that Elizabeth had privately expressed doubts about her engagement to Morrison and concerns about the isolation and hardship that characterized frontier life. According to these accounts, Elizabeth had been particularly troubled by the absence of other women her age and by the limited opportunities for intellectual or cultural engagement that the mining camp provided. She had mentioned in conversations with Eleanor Brennan that she sometimes felt trapped by circumstances and questioned whether she was suited for the demands of frontier marriage. These revelations suggested that Elizabeth's departure with Phillips might have represented not simply romantic infatuation, but a desperate attempt to escape a life she found increasingly unsatisfactory. Hayes's investigation also uncovered evidence that Phillips had been more systematic in his approach to Elizabeth than had been previously understood. Sarah Murphy, whose husband operated the camp's saloon, reported that Phillips had made careful inquiries about Elizabeth's background, family connections, and financial situation during his early weeks in Silver Creek. This pattern suggested that Phillips had identified Elizabeth as a target for manipulation, rather than having developed genuine romantic feelings that led to their elopement. The minister's findings provided a framework for understanding Elizabeth's disappearance that was more nuanced than the simple narratives of victimization or betrayal that had dominated previous discussions. Hayes proposed that Elizabeth had found herself caught between an unsatisfactory present and an uncertain future, vulnerable to the promises of a man who specialized in exploiting such vulnerabilities. Her departure represented neither pure victimization nor simple romantic choice, but a complex decision made under circumstances that limited her options and distorted her judgment. These insights brought a measure of closure to Silver Creek's residents, who had struggled for months with conflicting interpretations of events that touched on fundamental questions about trust, responsibility, and community solidarity. Hayes conducted a memorial service for Elizabeth in the autumn of 1853, not because her death had been confirmed, but because the community needed formal acknowledgement of their loss and recognition that their questions about her fate might never be fully answered. Morrison attended the service, but left Silver Creek shortly afterward, selling his mining claim and equipment to other prospectors. His departure marked the end of a chapter in the camp's history, but questions about Elizabeth's ultimate fate continued to surface periodically when travelers brought news from other mining settlements or when law enforcement officials made inquiries about historical cases involving confidence schemes. In 1858, nearly 6 years after Elizabeth's disappearance, a prospector working claims near the California border discovered human remains in a remote canyon approximately 80 miles southeast of Silver Creek. The remains were those of a young woman, and personal effects found at the site included items that authorities believed might have belonged to Elizabeth Hartwell. The location of the discovery, far from established trails and in terrain that would have been treacherous for inexperienced travelers, suggested that the woman had died under harsh circumstances while attempting to travel alone through the mountains. The discovery prompted renewed investigation into Elizabeth's case, but the deteriorated condition of the remains and the absence of reliable identification methods made definitive conclusions impossible. California authorities forwarded information about the discovery to territorial officials in Nevada, but by 1858, Silver Creek had evolved into a larger settlement with new residents who had little connection to the events of 1852. The investigation generated brief interest, but ultimately produced no conclusive results. Morrison had relocated to Oregon Territory by this time, where he had established a successful farming operation and had married a widow with 2 young children. When contacted about the discovery in California, he declined to travel to examine the remains, stating that he had found peace with his new life and preferred to leave questions about Elizabeth's fate unanswered. His response reflected a practical acceptance of uncertainty that contrasted with the obsessive pursuit of answers that had characterized his behavior during the months following Elizabeth's disappearance. The discovery near the California border represented the last significant development in Elizabeth Hartwell's case for nearly a decade. The woman's remains were buried in a small cemetery near the site where they had been found, marked only with a simple wooden cross that bore no name or date. The absence of positive identification meant that Elizabeth's family in Pennsylvania continued to hope for news of her survival, maintaining correspondence with territorial authorities and occasionally placing advertisements in Western newspapers seeking information about their missing daughter. In 1867, 15 years after Elizabeth's disappearance, Charles Edward Whitmore was finally captured by federal marshals in Colorado Territory, where he had been operating under yet another assumed identity while conducting confidence schemes targeting investment in silver mining operations. At the time of his arrest, Whitmore was 62 years old and had spent the intervening years moving throughout the Western Territories, always staying ahead of law enforcement while perfecting increasingly sophisticated methods of fraud. During interrogation following his arrest, Whitmore admitted to numerous criminal enterprises spanning more than 2 decades, including the schemes that had brought him to Silver Creek in 1852. When questioned specifically about Elizabeth Hartwell, however, he provided accounts that varied significantly in important details, making it impossible to determine which version represented the truth. In one telling, he claimed that Elizabeth had indeed accompanied him voluntarily and had died accidentally during their journey through the mountains when her horse had fallen while crossing a stream in difficult terrain. In a second account, Whitmore suggested that Elizabeth had grown frightened by the isolation of mountain travel and had attempted to return to Silver Creek alone, despite his warnings about the dangers of solitary travel through unfamiliar territory. According to this version, he had last seen her near a trading post in the mountains, where she had purchased supplies for what she claimed would be her return journey. Whitmore claimed that he had continued toward California alone and had never learned what became of Elizabeth after their separation. A third version of events emerged during later questioning sessions, in which Whitmore suggested that Elizabeth had been aware of his true identity and had willingly participated in planning criminal activities targeting other mining settlements in California. This account portrayed Elizabeth not as victim or reluctant accomplice, but as active partner in schemes designed to defraud prospective miners of their savings. According to this narrative, their relationship had ended not in tragedy, but in dispute over the division of profits from successful confidence schemes. The conflicting accounts provided by Whitmore reflected either his continued efforts to manipulate law enforcement for purposes of his own, or the genuine confusion of a man whose decades of assuming false identities had blurred the boundaries between memory and fabrication. Federal authorities found elements of each account plausible, but lacked independent evidence that would support any particular version of events. Whitmore was ultimately convicted and sentenced for crimes that could be documented through testimony and physical evidence, but questions about Elizabeth's fate remained officially unresolved. News of Whitmore's arrest and trial reached Silver Creek, which had grown into a substantial mining town with a population of several hundred residents. Among the longtime residents who remembered the events of 1852 was Eleanor Brennan, now in her 60s and serving as the town's unofficial historian. Brennan had maintained detailed notes about the community's early years, including extensive documentation of Elizabeth's disappearance and its impact on Silver Creek's social development. Brennan's records included information that had not been available to earlier investigators, including copies of letters that Elizabeth had written to friends in Pennsylvania during her months in Silver Creek. These letters, which had been shared with Brennan by their recipients after news of Elizabeth's disappearance became public, provided insights into Elizabeth's state of mind during the period leading to her departure with Phillips. The correspondence revealed a young woman who was indeed struggling with isolation and uncertainty about her future, but who had also expressed genuine affection for Morrison and gratitude for his efforts to build a life together in the challenging frontier environment. The letters complicated simple narratives about Elizabeth's motivations and suggested that her decision to leave Silver Creek represented the resolution of genuine internal conflict, rather than either purely impulsive behavior or calculated criminal planning. In her final letter, written approximately 2 weeks before her disappearance, Elizabeth had described her relationship with Morrison as solid, but acknowledged her struggles with the limited social and intellectual opportunities available in the mining camp. She had also mentioned meeting Phillips, but had characterized him only as a fellow traveler with interesting stories about other mining settlements. Brennan's documentation of the case proved valuable to territorial authorities who were attempting to establish patterns in Whitmore's criminal activities across multiple jurisdictions. The detailed account of events in Silver Creek provided insight into Whitmore's methods and confirmed that his approach to potential victims followed consistent patterns that could be used to identify other cases where his involvement was suspected but not proven. This information contributed to successful prosecutions in several other territories where Whitmore had operated during the 1850s and 60s. The completion of Whitmore's trial in 1868 marked the end of active investigation into Elizabeth's disappearance, but her story continued to circulate throughout mining communities in Nevada and California as an example of the particular vulnerabilities faced by women in frontier settlements. The case became part of the informal oral tradition through which frontier communities shared information about dangers and preserved collective memory of significant events. In 1875, more than 20 years after Elizabeth's disappearance, the construction of railroad lines through the region brought renewed attention to historical cases involving missing persons, as improved communication and transportation made systematic investigation more practical than it had been during the territorial period. Among the cases reviewed by newly established federal law enforcement agencies was Elizabeth Hartwell's disappearance, but the passage of time had eliminated most potential sources of new information. The town of Silver Creek had evolved by this time into a substantial mining center, with modern amenities including telegraph communication, regular postal service, and connection to regional transportation networks. The crude wooden structures of the 1850s had been replaced by permanent buildings constructed of local stone, and the population had grown to include multiple generations of families who had established deep roots in the community. The transformation reflected broader changes in Western settlement patterns as temporary mining camps evolved into permanent towns with stable institutions and cultural life. Among the few surviving connections to the events of 1852 was Morrison's former mining claim, which had been purchased and expanded by subsequent owners into one of the region's most productive gold extraction operations. The success of the claim provided ironic commentary on Morrison's decision to abandon his mining efforts in favor of pursuing Elizabeth, as the gold that had eluded him during his months of desperate work was eventually extracted by miners who approached the site with better equipment and more systematic methods. Morrison himself had died in Oregon in 1872, leaving behind a widow and stepchildren who knew little about his earlier life in Nevada. His transition from obsessed pursuer of a missing fiancée to successful farmer and family man illustrated the possibility of recovery and renewal that frontier life offered to those willing to accept uncertainty and move forward despite unresolved questions from their past. The final documented reference to Elizabeth Hartwell's case appeared in an 1879 territorial government report on missing persons cases from the gold rush period. The report noted that approximately 40 women had disappeared under suspicious circumstances in Nevada Territory between 1850 and 1870. And that fewer than half of these cases had been resolved through identification of remains or confirmation of the missing person's survival. Elizabeth's case was classified among those where insufficient evidence existed to determine the missing person's ultimate fate. The report acknowledged that frontier conditions during the gold rush period had created opportunities for both criminal activity and accidental death that were difficult to investigate using the limited law enforcement resources available at the time. Improved communication and transportation infrastructure had reduced these vulnerabilities for later residents. But the cases from the earlier period remained largely unresolvable due to the passage of time and the transient nature of mining community populations. For residents of Silver Creek in 1879, Elizabeth Hartwell had become a figure from local legend rather than personal memory. Her story told to illustrate the hardships and uncertainties that had characterized their community's early years. The details of her personality, her relationship with Morrison, and her reasons for leaving with Phillips had been simplified through repetition into a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting strangers and the importance of community solidarity in defending against threats to social stability. The legend of Elizabeth Hartwell served multiple functions for Silver Creek's residents, providing both entertainment and moral instruction while preserving memory of a period when their community had been more vulnerable to disruption by external forces. The story reinforced values of caution, loyalty, and mutual support that residents considered essential to maintaining the social cohesion that had enabled their town's transformation from temporary mining camp to permanent settlement. Yet questions about Elizabeth's true fate continued to surface occasionally, particularly when travelers brought news from other communities about historical cases involving confidence schemes or missing persons. Each such report prompted brief, renewed interest in Elizabeth's story and speculation about whether new information might finally provide answers to questions that had puzzled Silver Creek for more than a quarter century. In 1885, 33 years after Elizabeth's disappearance, the Nevada Territorial Historical Society began systematic collection of documents and oral histories related to the Gold Rush period. Among the materials they gathered were Eleanor Brennan's detailed notes about the Hartwell case, which were deposited in the Society's archives, along with copies of correspondence, newspaper accounts, and official records related to the investigation. The Historical Society's work preserved information about Elizabeth's case that might otherwise have been lost as the generation that had witnessed the original events passed away. The documentation provided a foundation for future researchers interested in studying the social dynamics of frontier communities and the particular challenges faced by women in mining settlements during the territorial period. The Society's records also included materials related to other missing persons cases from the same period, revealing patterns of criminal activity and social vulnerability that had affected multiple communities throughout the region. This broader context helped place Elizabeth's disappearance within larger historical trends, while preserving the specific details that made her story significant to Silver Creek's residents. The final entry in the Historical Society's records regarding Elizabeth Hartwell was made in 1889, and consisted of a brief note indicating that no new information about the case had emerged during the Society's research efforts. The note acknowledged that Elizabeth's ultimate fate would likely remain unknown, but expressed confidence that the preserved documentation would enable future generations to understand both the specific circumstances of her disappearance and its broader significance for understanding frontier social history. As the 19th century drew to a close, Elizabeth Hartwell's story had become part of the larger narrative of Western expansion and settlement, illustrating both the opportunities and dangers that had characterized frontier life during the Gold Rush period. Her case demonstrated how individual tragedies could reflect broader social tensions, and how communities responded to threats to their stability and values. The questions raised by her disappearance continued to resonate because they touched on fundamental issues of trust, loyalty, and responsibility that remained relevant even as frontier conditions evolved into more settled and secure social arrangements. The transformation of Silver Creek from isolated mining camp to prosperous town provided a fitting backdrop for reflecting on Elizabeth's story and its meanings for understanding Western history. The community that had been shattered by her disappearance in 1852 had rebuilt itself into something stronger and more resilient, demonstrating the capacity for recovery and growth that characterized successful frontier settlements. Yet the memory of Elizabeth Hartwell served as a reminder that this growth had come at a cost, paid not only by those who had suffered directly from frontier hardships, but also by those who had simply vanished into the vast spaces of the American West, leaving behind only questions and the enduring human need to understand what had become of those who disappeared into the silence of the mountains and deserts that defined the frontier experience. The echo of her story continues to whisper through the abandoned mining shafts and weathered buildings of what was once Silver Creek, a testament to the countless individuals whose lives were shaped and sometimes ended by the harsh realities of seeking fortune in an unforgiving land. And perhaps, in that silence that still settles over the Nevada mountains each evening, there remains something of Elizabeth Hartwell, forever young, forever lost, forever part of the mystery that was the American frontier. In 1903, more than 50 years after Elizabeth's disappearance, a final chapter was written to her story when a survey crew working on railroad expansion discovered a small leather journal wedged beneath rocks in a remote canyon approximately 90 miles from the original Silver Creek settlement. The journal, preserved by the dry mountain air, contained entries written in a woman's hand during the autumn of 1852. The entries, confirmed by handwriting analysis to match samples of Elizabeth's correspondence held in territorial archives, revealed her final weeks with devastating clarity. She had indeed left Silver Creek willingly with Phillips, believing his promises of a prosperous future in California mining ventures. But her trust had been systematically betrayed as Phillips revealed his true nature during their mountain journey. The journal's final entries described Phillips abandoning her at a remote trading post after stealing the money she had saved from selling her personal belongings. Elizabeth had attempted to return to Silver Creek alone, following mountain trails she barely understood, carrying only minimal supplies purchased with her remaining funds. The last entry, dated October 15th, 1852, described her growing weakness from hunger and exposure as early winter weather closed in around the high mountain passes. Her remains were never found, likely claimed by the same harsh wilderness that had defeated countless other travelers who underestimated the unforgiving nature of the Sierra Nevada mountains. But the discovery of her journal provided the closure that had eluded Silver Creek's residents for more than half a century. Elizabeth Hartwell had died not as willing accomplice to criminal schemes, but as another victim of the frontier's capacity to destroy those who trusted too readily and ventured too far from the safety of established communities. The journal was returned to Silver Creek, where it was placed in a memorial established in the town's cemetery. The memorial bore a simple inscription: Elizabeth Catherine Hartwell, 1829 to 1852. Lost to the mountains, remembered by those who knew her worth. The inscription made no mention of her engagement to Morrison or her departure with Phillips, acknowledging only her humanity and the community's enduring sense of loss. Today, the site of Silver Creek has returned to the wilderness from which it emerged, marked only by scattered foundations and the persistent whisper of wind through abandoned mine shafts. But somewhere in those mountains, in the silence between the wind and the settling of ancient rock, Elizabeth Hartwell's story endures as a reminder of the dreams and tragedies that shaped the American West, and of the price paid by those who dared to seek new lives in a land that offered both limitless possibility and swift, unforgiving judgment for those who chose poorly or trusted unwisely. The mountains keep their secrets well, but they cannot erase the human cost of the dreams they both nurtured and destroyed during those tumultuous years when gold fever drew thousands westward, and some, like Elizabeth Catherine Hartwell, simply vanished into the vast silence of the American frontier, leaving only questions that echo still through the canyons and peaks of Nevada's unforgiving landscape.